Hello and welcome to the last module of the IBM Instana Technical Overview course. My name is Włodek Dymaczewski and it's my pleasure to be your host in this course. This module's topic is REST APIs and integrations. Following the structure of previous modules, I will start with just a few slides presenting the different data exchange interfaces of Instana. Then, I will discuss briefly several most commonly used integrations that are available out of the box. Finally, I will show you in the live Instana demo environment how these elements work in practice. In general, there are two directions of the integration. We have the inbound integrations, where we want to send the data into Instana and make Instana use this data to correlate, to take actions, or to present in the interface, in the console. Or we have the outbound integrations, where we retrieve the data that Instana collected or produced, like the KPIs or the information about the relationship of the objects through the REST APIs. And of course, we can also have the alerts sent from Instana to the external systems. So with the inbound integrations, we have host agent REST API. The host agent API is the API that is exposed by the Instana agent running on an operating system. It uses the default port that Instana agent is using, 42699. Fun fact is that this number is the zip code of Solingen in Germany. And this is the city where Instana was initially founded and initially developed. So that's the story behind this number, specific number. And this API exposed by the agent has two plugins. One allows the client workload to send custom events to Instana. So we have covered events and alerting a few sessions back, but this is the functionality that lets you send the custom event directly into the Instana, not define it based on the metrics, but create the custom event directly in Instana using this API. And then there is a traces SDK and traces endpoint that lets you create custom calls and custom traces for the code that you are developing. So if there is any specific application, any special type of code that you would like to trace, and you would like to send the detailed information that cannot be otherwise collected by the normal runtime instrumentation, then this is how you can do this. Of course, there are some limitations. I would say one quite undocumented, but you will see this obvious limitation, is that this API on the agent is unauthenticated. So it's on the local host where the agent is, but any process can send to Instana agent the information using these endpoints. The maximum API calls is 20 per second. And of course, when you are sending traces, then there are limit of size. So that's about the agent. And the main REST API is exposed by the Instana backend. And as you probably know, Instana is written as the microservice-based application. So it consists of tens of different microservices communicating between them using the REST APIs and Kafka. And majority of the functionality, if not all of the functionality, is exposed through the APIs, and all of it is documented in the Open API format. The first line here shows the link to the GitHub, where you have the current version of the API documentation, and it provides access to every data that Instana collects about the metrics, about the configuration, about user tokens, everything. And of course, this REST API exposed by Instana backend is a basis for all the other integrations, like with Grafana, with the CI/CD pipeline feedback, and so on. Here, we do have the authentication. You require API token in order to read or write, so get or post the data from these services, from these endpoints. The access URL is the regular name of your Instana backend, whether it's SaaS or on-prem, it doesn't matter, /API and the following keywords. Of course, you can run these API calls using web browser, you can use curl, or there are also examples how you can integrate this with your scripting like Shell or PowerShell or Ruby or Python or whatever. And the most common use cases for this using this integration is getting the data that Instana collected out, like the metrics, or posting things, posting events, posting configurations. So creating, for example, the application perspectives when something new is deployed, rather than having somebody to click through the UI to create it, you can use this REST API to create application perspective. For Instana SaaS, there is a request limit, and by default, it's 5,000 API calls per hour. And there are headers in response that will let you understand how much of the limit you have used and when it will refresh. And if for any reason this fair use limit is not enough for you, there is always option to talk to sales representative about increasing that. Talking about the API tokens for authenticating requests. Every API call to Instana backend must be accompanied with the valid API token. There are two types of tokens. One is the personal token, which is like the impersonation of the user from the console. So when you create this token, it inherits the rights of the current user as which you are logged in. And then there are team or unit API tokens. They are account wide, and these are like the service accounts used for the integrations. And I'll show in the demo. You have here below settings, user settings, personal API tokens is the access path in the console. And for the unit-wide API tokens is setting, team settings, and API tokens. And by default, API tokens created are read-only unless you select permissions that you want to add to this token, and we will show it in the demo. Of course, if you have the right, you can create the access token using the Web REST API. And I think that's the last slide before the demo. The common integrations that are created using the REST APIs of Instana is the integration with Grafana. Grafana is an open source dashboarding solution, very popular, extremely versatile. It has really hundreds of data sources plugin available. So you can create very sophisticated dashboards joining the data from really different sources. And of course, Instana can be one of those sources. IBM provides the dedicated signed data source plugin that is available in Grafana catalog. And you can easily add it and then draw the data from Instana backend to create the dashboards in Grafana. Another quite popular integration is integration with Prometheus. Prometheus is another open source project for collecting metrics from the environment, and many of the applications, many of the open source projects provide the Prometheus endpoint where they expose internal metrics of that software. And if for any reason you have already invested into Prometheus and have these Prometheus metrics exposed, or if there is something that Instana agent is not collecting by its own, you can configure it to scrap those metrics. So periodically check the values and send them back to Instana backend. So you can use them for alerting, for dashboarding, and treat them the same way as the regular metrics that Instana detects. Another growing integration is OpenTelemetry. Probably it deserves a dedicated session, so I'll just mention that Instana agent can be configured, Instana agent and Instana backend both can be configured with the OpenTelemetry endpoints. So the OpenTelemetry collector can send the OpenTelemetry data, both metrics, logs, traces, into the Instana, and they are ingested and processed. I think I showed it when we discussed tracing. And the last popular integration is the CI/CD pipeline feedback. What I meant by this is that with the microservice-based application or cloud-native workloads, it's common that the application components, the services, containers are released quite often. They are released not daily, they are even released hourly. So one of the headache of the site reliability engineers is to understand if any performance problems that happened may be related to the change in the infrastructure or the code deployed. So CI/CD pipeline feedback is the mechanism in which you can inform Instana that specific components were released and create the release markers when the changes are made in environment, so they are properly visible in the user interface. And there are out-of-the-box integrations with multiple CI/CD tools like Jenkins, like Tekton, like many others. Let's stop the slides and move to the demo. So let's start with the Instana documentation. So to show you what's available for the further exploration, and the APIs are pretty well documented with a lot of examples. So here I am on the homepage of the IBM Instana observability. As you can see, this is the current latest release version 280. And on the left-hand side, if we scroll down, there is a header integration, SDK, and APIs. And if I unfold it, you can see here all of these things that I mentioned during the presentation are listed here. And for example, we have the host agent REST API. And here you have exactly the information about configuring OpenTelemetry, configuring the Prometheus metric scrapping, and these REST APIs for Event SDK and for the Trace SDK. And as you can see here, there are also multiple examples on how to use these endpoint with curl, with PowerShell, with Ruby, and so on. So as I mentioned during the presentation, this Event SDK is actually quite useful if you want to send some custom events from your batch processing or from your application into the Instana to inform the platform about things that happen. And then it is something that you can quite easily use. Let me show you this live. This is my Docker image, and I mean, well, the host name Docker, which is kind of misleading, but it's the one where I have the Instana agent running. This specific one runs as a Docker container, so Docker PS, Docker PS. You can see that I have the Instana agent running here. And the one thing that we can do is to send some events using the curl command. So I have prepared myself the custom payload for these REST calls for some different situations. For example, info.json, info.json. This is the custom payload to send informational event to Instana. And these are the fields that are maybe not required. I think that only the first two are required. The title, the text, the message, and severity, if it's not provided, it will be informational by default, and duration will say how long these should stay active in the Instana. So if I send this via curl using this command, so post to the Instana agent using localhost port 42699 and this event endpoint, and sending this payload. Boom, it's there. So how can we see it? So let's switch back to my Instana backend. Here is my server, which has this Docker agent reporting. Here you can see it. So if I go to the events and look for the changes, I'll stop you can see here tech intro informational event that was just recorded, and this is exactly the message that I've sent. And because it's the informational, so it was categorized as a change in Instana UI. And an additional thing that you can see, this is kind of a limitation of this method, but it is correlated only to the host, to the Instana agent. You cannot correlate it to any specific process or components. It's correlated to the host where the agent is running. So when I switch back, I can have some more sophisticated payload. So if we look at the warning, this is the issue, severity 5, and of course the same fields like the message. So if I send this to the Instana and rather than info, send to warning.json. Sorry, can't type. Again, it was ingested by the agent, and if we move back and look at the console and look at the issues, in a moment we'll see the event showing. Yep, here it is. You can see this is the warning, and again the same message. One thing about the changes, you can see that some of the changes are marked special kind of change. Something goes offline or online. So if I have the informational message, but the payload contains the word offline in the title, then Instana will qualify this change or this event, sorry, as the offline event. It still will be informational change event, but it will be marked as offline. So for some purposes, it can be useful to specifically use this syntax. So if I send offline.json, then boom, it will be offline. And rather than switching back and forth, I will generate the further two types of events. Here we have the critical. You see that the difference in payload is that the severity this time is 10. These are the values that are predefined, and they are documented in the Instana documentation. And when I run this one, so critical, it will create, hopefully, the event with the type of the issue critical. Yep, here you see, this is our tech intro critical. And if we go to changes and we filter, yeah, here it is, the tech intro offline. So if I event dot, yeah, I don't even have to further filter. You can see that I have the two events. Both are sent from my demo, but one was qualified as a change with some duration, and then the other, the offline, is just a 1 second offline event here. Okay, so what about the incidents? Can I create them using the API? Of course. So there is another pre-prepared payload that I created, incident. This time it has the, again, the severity 10, which will be critical, but the additional field incident equal true. And if I run this one, and we switch back to our view, you can see here we have the incident. And in a moment, we should see, yeah, you can see it. The Instana starts treating these incidents exactly the same way as the events and alerts generated natively. It correlated it with the previous critical event. So the incident is now correlated with this critical issue that I created before. And again, I can have here the automation policies triggered or recommended actions assigned, and exactly the same way as it would be with any other incident created from the native generated incidents. Okay, so that's all about the event API. Let's look at another API, which is the trace SDK. So if for whatever reason you are not happy with, or you want to have more content from your application about some internal processing, some batch processing, some scripts, or whatever available in Instana, then you can use this trace API to send the specific data. And here you have all about it. This is sample payload. I won't probably elaborate more on this, but you can see this is not that complex to understand. It's the span ID, trace ID, timestamp in epoch, which is milliseconds since January 1st, 1970, duration of the call, the endpoint name, type entry, the specific data related to this request, and then the exit span, which defines another call to another endpoint. And if we run that and send it to my Instana agent, I have exactly this example used here as a short script. So this is exactly this call, that local agent, generic trace endpoint, and the custom payload that we have here. So if I run it, it was sent. And now if we look back into the Instana console, we should see it in the traces. So let's go to analytics, calls, and if we look for last 5 minutes, it was the service name, CRM internal. Here is the call, the custom trace that we created, and you can see that's exactly the same look and feel as the traces collected natively by Instana, but this was fully created by the trace SDK and my custom call to agent Instana agent with this payload. So you can see that this is like the really made up endpoints and services. Let's switch to the second type of the Instana REST APIs. And here you see the whole documentation of the backend and also the information about how to use the tokens and how to interact with that API. And this is the documentation that is like on the IBM side. But then if you would like to use the tools like Swagger or like Postman or any other API management or testing tool, we have this API documentation exposed on GitHub, which is here. And this is the Instana REST API documentation. Every aspect of the Instana data is here. And at the top, you see that download OpenAI specification. If you click on that, it will download you the OpenAPI JSON that contains all this information in a portable OpenAPI format. Okay, so what you can do with it, for example, let's look at the application settings or application resources. Let's, for example, get all application catalog, get application tag catalog, or get application, let me do this, get application configuration. So here we see that the call is using this path after the Instana backend. And, when I just copy that path and I will add it to my https student labs.instana. Yeah, it's already there. So yeah. Okay. And if I run it, then I received the answer. And, I can either add into the header instruction to format properly the JSON output, or I can use these check marks if I'm using Google Chrome. But anyway, the result is that, yeah, this is the applications that I have defined. And I have two, all services, and the other one is quote of the day. And here you can see the application ID and some information about the configuration. Of course, if we go to the Instana applications, we can confirm that's exactly what we see. Yeah. So another example of the API is to get the services. So if we have, like, for example, the application resources get services, this is another API that I can call. And use it. Services. And we have all the services that Instana knows about, right? And as you can see, when I'm using this API, Instana also gives me some handy URLs to follow on. And for example, if I have the service called Zookeeper, or maybe there is a lot of them. So you can see that working this way is probably not the best way, because you have a lot of data, so you would need some filtering. And I can, of course, parse this data and copy this string, right? And then when I paste it into the browser, then I will get the details of each endpoint that this specific service provides. And of course, then you can use the ID to use other APIs to get the metrics and settings and all the stuff. And for example, if we talk about the infrastructure resources, if we would like to get the, maybe not infrastructure metrics, if we would like to get the metrics that Instana collected, we have to provide some payload that will filter down the specific type of information that we want. And of course, it's not very useful to do this in the browser. So let me switch to the command line and use the curl for that. So this will also show you the difference. One thing that you may have noticed that because I'm logged into the Instana console in the same browser, then I wasn't asked about any API token because it's basically cached by the browser. So it's being automatically sent to the Instana backend with every request. However, if I switch to the console, right, and we'll try to extract something using the curl, then it's very likely that I will receive the information that my operation is not authorized. So for example, before I do this, let me show you one more thing. If you would like to filter things in the API, you can provide the quite complex JSON that will filter things down using the dynamic focus query. However, Instana has something very useful here. If we go to the analytics and if we filter down, for example, that I want to see the API calls and I want it to be from the application quote of the day and it should be grouped by service name, then here is this small button API query, which will give me the very handy URL with the filter about exactly what the data I have here in this dashboard. So I can just copy it and paste it into my console. Yep, and here we have the results. So let me maybe prettify it. So yeah, here is all the data about the services and the metrics that's exactly the same as the one that I've shown in the UI. It worked because I have, while testing before this demo, created already the token. So if I echo it, it will be there. Yeah, so let me show it you in the UI where it came from. So if we go to settings, two options. One is the user settings and the personal API tokens. And when you create the new personal token, you just provide the name. And that's it. So my token, save, and that's it. You have your token and there is not much you can do with it. You can just copy and use it. And this token will inherit all the permissions of the user who created it. And then in the Steam settings, we have the special option of API tokens. And here is the token that I created. So this is the token which has by default, if I create the token, I can give it the name. And then you can see there are multiple permissions, but they are turned off by default. So the API token created in that way is read-only. It can read all the data from Instana backend, but it will not allow you to make any changes. So the token I already have here, pipeline feedback, was modified to allow me to configure the releases. So I'll be able to create the release markers in the Instana using these token. Okay. So that's the one that I used. Okay. One another thing that I can use this token for can be to create the application perspective configuration. And of course, we have all of it in the documentation, Instana API, application configuration, application settings, and add application configuration. And of course, you have here all the documentation of the fields that are required. But the easiest way is to get some application configured in the UI and then use the get configuration to receive the payload and modify it to your liking. So I did it before, and here we have the payload that I robot shop JSON, and this is the application configuration in the format required by Instana API. It's very similar to the quote of the day, except that it's a robot shop application and it's based on the Kubernetes namespace value robot shop, and it should include all downstream services and all calls, and that's more or less it. So if I run the curl command to create the application, actually I should not be able to create the application because I don't think we have the permission to create the application configuration. Yeah, we should not. So if I run this call, we should receive the error that we are not authorized. Yep, exactly. Insufficient access rights for resource method, missing permission can configure applications. So if I go back to the Instana UI and add this configuration of applications permissions to my API token, right? And switch back to the demo system and run this call again. This time we have the application robot shop configured, and in a moment we can confirm it in the UI. So if we go to applications, here you see the robot shop application that is using the Kubernetes namespace robot shop, all downstream services and all calls exactly as we specified in the payload. So if I click the live button, you can see the data already flowing through that application perspective, and you can see data in the dashboard. So this way you can have the automated way of creating application perspectives when you are, for example, deploying multiple instances of some applications for different offices or different regions. Then you can have it automated that the relevant application perspective will be created at the moment when you deploy a new application instance. Okay, few words about the Prometheus. It's all here in the documentation, how you can add the proper configuration to the Instana agent, about what endpoint should be scraped. So I'll just show you this already running in another demo system. So here we have in the Instana demo on the SaaS. And if I go to the infrastructure view and I filter for entity type equal Prometheus, you will see that there is one Prometheus app defined, and it has some metrics. We can open the dashboard for it, and you can see that this is probably some Informix server, because we see here multiple metrics related to Informix. So this is something that Instana will automatically collect, and for each of these metrics you can then have the small graph here in the dashboard. There is not much information, not much change. But what you can do else with this data, of course, you can use it in the event definitions, or you can use it to define your custom dashboard. So if we go to custom dashboards, this is my custom dashboard that I created before. and I want to add the widget that will use my specific Prometheus collected data. Then I'm adding widget, for example, chart time series, next, and select data source. If I go to infrastructure and platforms, select metric, I can scroll down to find out my Prometheus app, and then any of the metrics that Instana is collecting, for example, the checkpoints total. And if you scroll down, you will see the sample of the data. It's pretty static, so it's one value. Actually, this one is 0, so not very nice. But you see the point, yeah? You can add your own widgets showing the metrics and apply the aggregations, like, for example, mean or the percentile or sum or rate, depending on the type of the metric collected. But what about Grafana? Yeah, I have here the instance of Grafana running locally. I'll log into it. I won't change the password. This is just the default Grafana image downloaded from the Docker Hub and running locally on my laptop. So the first thing I have to do is to install the Instana plugin. I do this by going into the administration plugins, then search the catalog for Instana. It's there. Just click install. It takes a few moments and it's already installed. So the next step is to add a new data source. And if I click this link, it will take me to the Instana configuration. And one caveat here, because this is using the Grafana proxy and this requires the properly signed HTTPS connection. If I would try to connect to my training image which uses the self-signed certificate, this will fail. So I need to create the request token from the SaaS instance, like here. Let me go to this will be my server. And then the API key, API tokens. Let me create the pharma token, save. Here we have the token. So if I copy it here, at the bottom, I have the save and test, and boom, you see Grafana was successfully connected to my Instana backend and is able to either build a new dashboard or explore. So I will just check if it works with the Explorer view. And you can see here that this plugin already provides you the filtering options from the Instana. So for example, Instana built-in metrics, and I can specify that I want, for example, the analyze application calls, and I can filter by application. So in the meantime, it collected the information about what is available. So for example, the robot shop, and the endpoint name can be anything, and metric, call count. And if we run this query, you can see here that we have the data from the Instana backend in my Grafana, and I can do whatever I like. Okay. So the last element of today's demo is the pipeline feedback. So let me switch back to my local machine. And I have here my applications, one that I defined manually, the code of the day, and another robot shop. And there in Instana API, we have the special section about the release markers. And if I scroll down in Instana releases, here we have all the documentation about getting and creating releases. Of course, it's also documented in the Instana API. If we have the pipeline feedback integration, then you see how to use it with Circle CI, with Jenkins, with GitHub Actions, and so on. But also you have the examples how to create these release markers using curl, and that's what I will do right now. So if I switch back, let me maybe clear this view. I have created here some of the scripts that will do the release markers. So let me start with the create global release. And this is the script that will define custom payload. It's just the name and the current time in the epoch format, and we'll send it to the my Instana using API releases, and using my API token. So let me just run it. Create global release. Okay, it worked. So how it's visible in the UI, if we go to my applications, for example, the quote of the day, you can see here that we have this launch rocket icon that was just added. And this is the global release. So using the time picker, you can see that in the releases, we have the just added tech intro demo global release, and it will be visible on any graph on any application, any service, any endpoint, because it's global. So maybe rather than running, I will just show you the ones that I ran before. So this is the payload looks very similar. For example, the create service release. You see that just the payload is slightly more sophisticated. It has the service that it should be scoped and maybe the application in which this service should be selected. So just a very selective release. And then if you run these, then you will end up having service release like that, which is the only visible in the quote of the day for that specific service. And if I go, for example, for the application and services and QOTD ratings, it won't be visible there. I have only global one, because the other one was scoped only for the quote of the day application view. Okay, with that, let me finish the demo and go back to my slides. Quick summary. I showed you the different REST APIs that are available in Instana, the one that is exposed on the host agent, the one that is exposed in the Instana backend, and I showed you in action some of the integrations with Grafana and CI/CD pipeline integration. So that was the demo. And of course, you have links here to all these pieces in the Instana documentation or on the GitHub. With that, let me conclude the last session. Thank you very much.